This elusive Japanese author once wrote a novel so popular, so groundbreaking, and so controversial that he had to leave his home country of Japan. If you haven't guessed by now, the author is, of course, Haruki Murakami. The novel is Norwegian Wood, often cited as his most accessible book, acting as a kind of gateway drug for avid readers such as myself. The novel was such a flash flood success that Murakami practically became famous overnight, so much so that he was inundated with fan mail and mobbed at public places and airports. And as often seems to be the case, along with newfound fame also comes infamy. Murakami became the talk of the town, receiving both an overwhelming sense of critical acclaim and public acclaim, as well as some controversy, creating a suffocating experience that led to Murakami eventually packing up and leaving Japan. Welcome to Between the Lines, Books and Films. My name is Dylan, and I'm here to share my passion for storytelling with you by exploring iconic books and films. In today's video, I'll talk to you about Haruki Murakami's Norwegian Wood, why it became such a massive success both in Japan and overseas, what makes it stand out from its plot, characters, and style, and ultimately whether I think you should read Norwegian Wood or not. This will be a spoiler-free video, so if you haven't heard of or read Norwegian Wood yet, I won't ruin the first-time experience for you. Before we start, if you enjoy discovering new books and films and discussing them with like-minded people, please feel free to subscribe to my channel where I'll be sharing all kinds of interesting stories. Norwegian Wood tells the story of Toru Watanabe, who's transported back to memories of his formative days as a university student in Tokyo during the 1960s, after he hears an orchestral rendition of Norwegian Wood by the Beatles during a plane landing. Toru reminisces this bittersweet period of his life during the infamous 1960s student protests in Tokyo, recounting his complicated relationships with two very different young women, Naoko, the melancholic, introspective, and oftentimes mysterious ex-girlfriend of Toru's childhood best friend Kizuki, and Midori, an eccentric, passionate, and emotionally complex fellow student from university. The young Toru is an equally complex character, quiet, introspective, and obsessed with Western literature and music. The setup is relatively straightforward, but what makes this novel in particular shine is the characters and the very unique style that Murakami writes. Immediately, we're introduced to the fact that the story is being told through the lens of memory and nostalgia. This is an older, somewhat jaded Toru remembering his youth, which paints the story through a deeply nostalgic and oftentimes melancholic perspective. Not only that, but this reminiscence is prompted by Toru hearing the orchestral rendition of Norwegian Wood on a plane landing in Germany many years later after the events of the actual story. The implication of this to me is that this time period in Toru's life was deeply significant and very important and possibly haunting, and you get the sense that he's tried to move on from this and maybe even forget it. But hearing this music brings back all kinds of memories, and obviously it was a very painful time for him. It reminds me of this quote from Casablanca.
Of all the gin joints in all the towns in all the world, she walks into mine.
The same way that we as individuals often experience memories and nostalgia and recalling specific times in our lives when things were maybe more vivid or felt more significant, even all these years later. If Murakami was simply recounting the events of the story as they were happening, I'm not sure it would have the same impact as it does the way that the story's told. Because when we remember times in our lives, we're not remembering the events exactly as they happened. Oftentimes we add supplementary material and additional memories or feelings that kind of blend things together, creating a new memory or a new experience. It's very complicated and interesting, and it reminds me of the principles behind Impressionist painting, where you kind of insinuate or allude to larger details by dotting around vague shapes and outlines and things that kind of imply at a larger picture. But by doing this, you kind of capture more of the feeling rather than the actual reality of a situation. It's a great way to tell the story, and it's a very unique perspective. It's somewhat of an unreliable narrator, which makes it feel very sincere and authentic. It's a great way of telling the story, and it's a very universal perspective that I'm sure many people can relate to because of the way that he explores nostalgia and memory. Here's a quote from Toru at some point in the book that really encapsulates this whole idea. "Memory is a funny thing. When I was in the scene, I hardly paid it any mind. I never stopped to think of it as something that would make a lasting impression. Certainly never imagined that 18 years later I would recall it in such detail. I didn't give a damn about the scenery that day. I was thinking about myself. I was thinking about the beautiful girl walking next to me. I was thinking about the two of us together, and then about myself again." It was the age, that time of life when every sight, every feeling, every thought came back like a boomerang to me. And worse, I was in love. Love with complications. The scenery was the last thing on my mind. It's actually quite hard to record and drink tea and hold the cup at the same time. It's making my hands all sweaty. I'm sure everybody has times in their lives that feel more significant and more vivid than others. Often when we're young, the details of things seem much more clearer and much more important. From the music we're listening to, the clothes we're wearing, or the company that we keep. Even simple things like the quality of light outside, or the way that colors look. And this is something Murakami really excels at. He's amazing at describing scenes in very simple ways that feel evocative and bring the imagery to mind. He has just one example of many showing Murakami's skill at this, and seriously, he does this like countless times. Every chapter, he's just an expert at painting the scenes, and it's so relaxing to read because I really can picture exactly what he's describing. Colors shone with exceptional clarity in the rain. The ground was a deep black, the pine branches a brilliant green, the people wrapped in yellow looking like special spirits that were allowed to wander the earth on rainy mornings only. This is something Murakami captures perfectly. He's an absolute expert at capturing these very specific scenes and emotions that bring to mind all kinds of feelings within us as the readers. But what makes Murakami exceptional is his ability to take something that's already remarkable and elevate it even higher. It's like if you were climbing a mountain and you thought you had reached the peak, only to discover that you've actually just reached a summit, and you look up and you see that there's a whole nother place to climb. The book tackles these themes of memory and nostalgia, both in a general sense that many people can relate to, but also in a very haunting and tragic way that people who've had difficult experiences or trauma in their lives can definitely relate to and understand. Memory is definitely a recurring theme in Murakami's stories. There's a quote from one of his other novels, Kafka on the Shore. Memories warm you up from the inside, but they also tear you apart. Unfortunately, as time goes on, memories do become foggy and hard to remember, and the only way to truly recapture those feelings is to spend even more time looking back and reflecting, which can be really painful because as you move on in life, you have to continue living in the present. So to live your life looking in the rearview mirror is kind of dangerous. Here's another quote from Norwegian Wood that captures this. And as the years have passed, the time has grown longer. The sad truth is that what I could recall in 5 seconds, all too needed 10, then 30, then a full minute, like shadows lengthening at dusk. Someday, I suppose, the shadows will be swallowed up in darkness. You do get the sense that Toru is really haunted by this particular time in his life and the memories and emotions that were associated with it. And I can't help get the feeling when I'm reading it that I feel worried and concerned for the modern day Toru, who's more jaded and obviously has moved very far away. He's doing something in Germany, which is never explained. We don't really get an idea of what the future Toru looks like in any concrete way, but we definitely get the sense by the way that he explains the story that maybe he's still affected by this and maybe he's still hurt, and it's unclear how he coped with it and how he survived. Like I said, I won't spoil anything specific, but there is a lot of upsetting stuff that happens in this book, and there are a lot of darker topics explored. Because of this, it could be a challenging read for some people. There's definitely some really disturbing stuff that happens here, and I'm fairly sure that it wasn't written for fun. I think it was really to expand the emotional depth and reach of the story, because there's some highs in this story, there's some great moments, and it definitely captures the emotional highs of these very vivid times in our lives, especially from like formative years as a young person in your teens or your early 20s. Any great storyteller knows the importance of contrast, and if you really want to portray the highs and lows of life, you have to show opposites. So Murakami uses these really disturbing scenes and disturbing topics, and I think that elevates the highs of the story, and it creates like an interesting contrast in the story. So yes, there are some parts of the story I don't enjoy reading, but they definitely make it more emotionally rich. I've probably spent too much time prattling on about memory and nostalgia and this sort of narrative device that Murakami uses, but that just leads me to my next point. It's one of many amazing things that Murakami does with his writing that's really remarkable and makes him stand apart from other authors. On top of an already unique perspective, he writes in a deceptively simple style. His writing never feels confusing or convoluted. Sometimes when I'm reading novels, I have to go back and reread pages because the writing is very dense and it's not easy to digest on a first read. And Murakami doesn't write in that sense at all. I feel like it's very easy to digest, and the entry level is extremely simple for most levels of readers. And Norwegian Wood is one of the books that got me back into reading again, because for a period of my time I didn't really read as much as I used to when I was a kid, because I feel like school made reading kind of a chore. Which is ironic because I now absolutely love reading, and I absolutely love hyperanalyzing stories, which is something I didn't particularly enjoy in school. Norwegian Wood introduced me to all kinds of other stories and all kinds of authors that I had never heard of and I had never even thought about, so I'm so grateful that I have picked up this book. I first read it about 6 or 7 years ago now, and I've read it a few times since then, and it's just a really special book to me. And I'm really grateful that he writes in such a style that is easy to access, because reading did become daunting to me for a while, and although I would now classify myself as more of an experienced reader, and I tackle books that are slightly more difficult, at least for me. At the moment I'm reading The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoevsky, and this book is really dense and I'm struggling to get through it. There's some really special moments, but ultimately I am finding it quite challenging to get through, and it's taking me a very long time because I don't like to speed through things. I want to actually understand it. So yes, Murakami, he writes in a really simple, clear voice. He's very concise, he's not too wordy, and he's an absolute master at finding unique metaphors for explaining situations, feelings. But despite having a really clear and simple voice and way of writing, the details between the lines are very deep, and you can analyze them on multiple different levels, and it creates a very unique reading experience because depending on the way that you look at things, you can ascertain different information and come up with all kinds of theories and ideas about the characters, the story, and the themes. Another one of Murakami's greatest strengths is his ability to create and write engaging and unique characters with very distinct voices. He really captures a sense of realism in the dialogue, and exchanges between characters feel very natural and follow the flow of conversations that you would have in regular life, but it's sort of heightened, so it's like these conversations, most of the conversations in the story are probably the most interesting conversations that you would have with other people, at least if you're someone that enjoys the topics covered in Murakami's stories. From the passionate and eccentric Midori, to the melancholic and mysterious Naoko, and even side characters like Stormtrooper, who's Toru's quirky roommate that he shares a room with in university, the charismatic and womanizing Nagasawa, who's obsessed with the Great Gatsby, and then Reiko, the enigmatic and possibly sinister older woman, depending on the way you look at things. I won't spoil anything. And of course Toru himself, the lone wolf, outsider, introspective, reflective lead of the story. Many people critique Toru's role in the story as the narrator, which I can certainly understand because he is quite a passive narrator. He doesn't really lead the action on things. He kind of just drifts along and goes with the flow, which leads him to get into all kinds of quirky and bizarre situations and relationships with other people. But I actually think this is one of the book's greatest strengths because it allows all the other characters in the story to shine. Toru kind of acts as like a conduit. I don't know if that's the word, but what I mean is that because he is quite a passive character and he kind of just listens to people and acts slightly, I don't know, he's like a sponge. Like, he's the sort of person that draws eccentric characters to him and they just want to tell him all their secrets and their stories because he listens, and most people want to be listened to, which is fun. It's a unique perspective because a lot of people don't know how to listen to other people's stories or how to be this kind of person that draws people into them and the kind of person that people want to tell these things to. And yes, Toru doesn't really take much action throughout the story. I mean, he does do some things, but I can't really spoil exactly what happens, but he's not like some grand hero character. He's a very unusual protagonist in that sense, and I wouldn't really describe him as a protagonist. He's just the person who we're experiencing the story through, and he doesn't need to be some amazing hero who takes all these big steps and sacrifices himself or anything like that, because after all, this period in Toru's life is a time when he's young and he doesn't have the answers, and he finds himself in a very complicated and emotionally charged situation, and most young people wouldn't know how to react to that. If Toru wasn't a passive narrator, I'm not sure if the story would reach the same depths of the topics that it tackles emotionally as it does the way that it's currently written. Plus, Murakami clearly has an amazing ability to write unique and interesting characters, so the choice to have Toru as more of a passive narrator is definitely a stylistic choice, and it's something I personally agree with, but I can see why some people might not find that particular kind of character engaging to spend longer periods of time with. As I said, I won't get into all the spoilers. Maybe in the future I'll make another video exploring some of the themes and ideas in the story, and I'll be able to tackle spoilers and analyze characters and motivations and things like that. But as I'm sure you can probably tell, this book is very unique and something very special and dear to me, and it kind of got me excited about books in the first place, so this is why I wanted to make my first video on this channel about Norwegian Wood, because I think it's something that I want to share with other people. And if I could go back in time and recapture the first experience of reading Murakami's stories, I would do that in a heartbeat, because it opened the world up to me in such a unique way that I hadn't experienced for a very long time. And as I'm sure you can probably tell, the way I'm describing the book, of course, it had all the right ingredients to make a big hit, and it did become a big hit. Norwegian Wood exploded in Japan, not literally, and it became the go-to book for people to read. Everyone was reading Norwegian Wood. Housewives, school children, toddlers, maybe not quite everyone, but everyone was talking about it. And it also later received an English translation among many other international translations, and as I said, it was like a gateway drug to Murakami's other writing, because he usually writes in the magical realism genre, which is very different. Norwegian Wood is his most normal book, and even then there's some very bizarre stuff that happens, but nothing quite magical. So it's very accessible, it's a great entry point to get into his style. So what makes Murakami so unique as an author? Well, he's a bit of an oddity in the literature scene. He didn't actually start writing until he was 29, I believe. Up until that point, he famously owned and ran a jazz bar in Tokyo called Peter Cat, and he spent most of his time serving clients, cooking food, and listening to jazz music. And I'm sure that during this time he met all kinds of interesting and eccentric characters, which would probably be a large reason as to why he's so gifted at creating characters and capturing the distinct voices that people speak in. It wasn't until he famously attended a baseball game and witnessed an American baseballer hitting a home run that he suddenly had the epiphany to become a novelist. And this is a very mysterious and interesting story that he often cites as the reason to why he started writing. And I personally think the implication of this story is that he saw this American baseball player who was playing for a team in Japan, and he thought, if this guy who lives far away from his home country can come out here and do something remarkable, then why can't I? And he tried his hand at writing, and he wrote some very interesting stories, which led him to become successful enough to pursue it as a career. And straight off the bat, he wrote in a very unusual style, possibly unburdened by the preconception and expectations of his peers in the literary scene in Japan. And of course, he was influenced heavily by Western literature and jazz music, very similar to Toru in Norwegian Wood. In Japan, I've heard that many people feel that Murakami writes in a Western style, which makes him unusual in Japan as well, and some people don't like that. They feel like he's not representing the Japanese voice very well, and other people enjoy it, of course, because he's clearly successful. And then in the West, he's equally a bit of an oddity, because he's writing about experiences and stories in Japan, and he's doing it in a very unique voice that it definitely does capture some of the stylistic choices and things in Western literature. Like, the characters in his stories don't necessarily behave in a way that the characters in other Japanese stories do behave. They're all kind of outsiders and kind of do their own thing, and they're very individualistic. But in short, Murakami just knows what he likes, and he's not burdened by the ideas and thoughts of other authors or how things should be done. He just does what he likes, and it works very well, and it's incredibly unique. There's not really anyone else quite like him. If I did have to think of maybe some other authors who kind of have a similar style, I would definitely say J.D. Salinger, Kurt Vonnegut, and David Mitchell. not the comedian, the author who wrote Cloud Atlas. But in David Mitchell's case, he was influenced heavily by Murakami, and he actually went on to write his own novel inspired by Murakami called Number 9 Dream, also taken from a John Lennon song. So, you know, Beatles songs seem to be the magic source for interesting stories set in Japan. Anyway, that's enough of my rambling. Should you read Norwegian Wood? My answer would be an absolute yes. But I would go in with some warnings. Like I said, there's some sensitive topics talked about, and it might not be for everybody. And I know Murakami's style isn't for everyone, especially because he usually writes in the magical realism genre, which inherently is kind of vague sometimes and goes beyond the limitations and logic of like rational thinking and stuff that could logically happen. And sometimes his stories are difficult to follow if you are a very logical person who likes to understand why things are happening and like the cause and effect and everything. And although his stories can be like this, they do tend to follow a strange sense of logic, which is grounded more by emotions and vibes and atmosphere. And that's something I personally am a huge fan of, because that's the way I experience the world. I'm not a logical person whatsoever. I do everything based on emotions and how I'm feeling. But having said that, Norwegian Wood is his most normal book, and it's a great entry point to get into his style, because like I said, he's got a very unique way of writing, and I feel like this is a great place to start. It's really good entry point for the larger audience to get a sense of how he writes before you move on to his more complex stories and iconic stories like Kafka on the Shore and the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle and the epic 1Q84. But that brings me to the end of this video. As I said, I've started this channel to share my passion for storytelling through exploring iconic books and films, and hopefully starting a discussion point. And I am a massive fan. If you haven't noticed by now, I'm wearing a t-shirt that is covered with Murakami book titles. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to leave a like, a friendly comment, or subscribe for more. And if you have read Norwegian Wood, please let me know in the comments what you thought. Did you enjoy it? Did you hate it? I'm just curious to hear other people's opinions. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.